are you ready? We're going to have a quiz. Now, those of you that have already seen this quiz, don't jump out and give an answer. Only those who have never seen this quiz. Are you ready? As you know, this teaching is a series we've been doing on replacement theology. As you know, even a little leaven can leaven the whole lump. So does a little replacement theology permeates everything. So with that said, I'm going to show you some different pictures, and everyone tell me who you think these different pictures are of, or is there one person you recognize? Who is it? Okay, which one's Napoleon? I am going to show you the different artists. There were 4 different artists that painted these. 4 different artists. See if you notice in the similarities. Here's the first one. The guy on the far right is the guy who painted that Napoleon. Here's the next one. That's the guy who painted that one. Here's the guy who painted that one. Here's the guy who painted that one. None of them are Napoleon. None of them are Napoleon. We think we know Napoleon when we see him, and none of us have seen him. The problem is, even with God, everyone wants to paint him in their own image rather than realizing we're created in his image. This is why the deception will be so great when the Antichrist comes. None of those are Napoleon. These are historical pictures by different artists, and they use themselves in the mirror to paint him. Well, guess what? Replacement theology is a very dirty mirror. And that's why you have a South Korean Jesus, a Mexican Jesus, a black Jesus, a white Jesus. None of them are the picture of what he looked like. Not one picture that you've ever seen of the real Yeshua have you ever seen. This is what we do. We all try to create him in our image. It doesn't work that way. Let me see. Okay. Look at this. I want to tell you where everything started. Many of you have heard of Socrates. Okay. Greek philosophy. He lived from 469 to 399 BC. He was the teacher of Plato, who was 428 to 348. He was the teacher of Aristotle, okay, from 384 to 322. And guess what? He was the teacher of Alexander the Great, who conquered the whole area for the Greek Empire. And he was from 356 to 323. Then you have Antiochus Epiphanes with the story of Hanukkah from 215 to 163 BC. He was with the Syrian Greek. And then from 106 to 43, we have Cicero, a Roman philosopher. All right. Now, let's watch as history unfolds. There was a gentleman who lived the exact same time as Yeshua did. He was from 63 BC to 23 AD. Okay, so he was about 70 years old when Messiah was born, and he died about 7 years before Yeshua did. But he was a geographer, he was a historian, he was a philosopher, and there's a copy of his book that he wrote 2,000 years ago. You can actually go online and get it. Of course, you know, back then, 2,000 years ago, the geography, they didn't know anything about America. You know, they just kind of had their own little world that he put in. But his life was characterized by extensive travels. Okay, he moved to Rome around the age of 21, which is in 44 BC, and he stayed there in Rome studying, writing, and he is most famous for a 17-volume work called Geographica. Okay, which presented a descriptive history of people and places from different regions of the world that was known in his era. Now, get a load of this. Many of you know this map. That's Turkey. That's where we were on our last trip. And I want you to notice in yellow is Cilicia, and there's a little town there called Tarsus. Who's ever heard of Tarsus? Who lived in Tarsus? The Apostle Paul. And you can see the epistle to the Galatians was to the people that lived in the green area called Galatia. all right? And that was called Asia. Most of us think of Asia, we think of China, but right through the top left corner is where Asia really separates from Europe. And you're going to see some other little places that I'm going to be talking about here in a minute. But listen to what Strabo wrote. He wrote that the people who lived in Tarsus, and who lives there? Paul, have devoted themselves so eagerly, not only to Greek philosophy, but to the whole round of education in general. In other words, the people in Tarsus are really smart. It says they have, when you think of Greek philosophy, what cities do you think of? Athens, Alexandria, Egypt. 2,000 years ago, this guy wrote that the people in Tarsus surpassed Athens and Alexandria or any other place that could be named where there are schools and lectures of philosophers. It was full of universities 2,000 years ago, and their main topic in Tarsus was Greek philosophy. Guess what? Paul went to school there. Can you believe it? This Jewish rabbi goes to school at a Greek philosophy school. And I'm going to prove that. But first, listen to Acts 21:39. Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of what? Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. Now look at this next verse, Acts 22:27. The chief captain came and said to Paul, are you a Roman? And he said, yeah. Okay, let's think a minute. You know, in most countries, they know several languages. In America, they only know one, typically. Many Americans know other languages, but for the most part, not. But we see here that that Paul is a Roman citizen. So what language does he speak? Latin. He's also a Jew. He knows Hebrew. He knows Aramaic. Guess what? He knows Greek. I mean, because he also spoke in Greek. And, and so, I mean, this guy knows like 4 languages fluently. He's very well educated. Now, here's a verse I added to your notes. Just write it down and I'll read it, but you can have it in your notes. And I want you to kind of follow this map too. You can follow the map while I'm reading. So here's Paul. He was in Antioch in Syria. He goes to Cyprus, if you remember, and then they go up to Perga. You can see what Perga is. And here's what I have. When they departed from Perga, this is Acts 13:14, they came to Antioch in Pisidia. So there's 2 Antiochs. There's an Antioch in Syria, and there's an Antioch in Pisidia. This is the area of Pisidia. Here's Antioch. It's not in the yellow, it's right here. And this area is known as Pisidia. And so they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. How many of you know that wasn't Sunday? Paul is keeping the Sabbath. He goes into the synagogue, and it says they sat down. After the reading of the Torah and the prophets, the Haftorah, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them, okay, here's our Jews traveling from around the world, and they say, hey, you brethren, if you have anything of exhortation, let the people know. So he begins talking about the Messiah. Okay, so then what happens? They end up chasing him out of Perga. And so now what happens in Acts 14:1 and 2, they're now in Iconium. And you can see Iconium right here. Then they're going to go to Lystra, then they're going to go to Derbe. But let's watch what happens. When they're in Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, what area are they in? Galatia. You might say the county is Lycaonia, but they're in Galatia. And so in Acts 14:1 and 2, now in Iconium, they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and they gave such a teaching that a great number of Jews and Greeks had faith. What does that mean? There were Greeks in the synagogue. They were meeting in a church. There were no churches in the New Testament. I know people, well, it says church. That's English. Okay, they were in an assembly, and the assembly was the synagogue. Okay, and so what does it say? Greeks were there too, and they had faith. But those Jews who did not have faith made the minds of the Gentiles bitter against the other Gentiles that were there in the synagogue. So here you have Jewish believers and Jewish unbelievers, Gentile believers and Gentile unbelievers, and the Jewish unbelievers go to the Gentile unbelievers and tell them to get on the Gentile believers. Everyone following me? Okay, so what do we have? In Acts 14, 5 through 7. And when a violent attempt was made by the unbelieving Gentiles and the unbelieving Jews with their rulers to make an attack on them and have them stoned, having got news of it, they said, we're out of here. And they went to Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe. So there we see they're right there in Lystra, and then they went to Derbe, the country. And they went on preaching the good news there. So now let's look at what happens in Acts 14, 11 through 13. When the people saw this miracle that Paul did, they all said in a loud voice, in the language of Lycaonia, the gods have come down to us in the form of men. And they gave the name of Jupiter to Barnabas, and to Paul that of Mercury, because he was the chief talker. And then the priest of the image of Jupiter, which was before the town, took oxen and flowers to the doors of the town and was about to make an offering with the people. Okay, so here we are. They went to Iconium, and then Lystra, and then Derbe, and they're in Derbe, and all of a sudden, a priest of the Jupiter wants to do worship. So what do we know about the Galatians? They worship the planets. They worship the sun. They worship the moon. They worship Jupiter and Mercury. So the Galatians are stupider and worship Jupiter. Okay? So that's the Galatians. They worship the heavens. So let's watch what happens. In Acts 14 and verse 15, he didn't say, you dumb people. He said, good people. Why are you doing these stupid things? We are men with the same feelings as you, and we give you the good news so that you may be turned away from the foolish things of worshiping the planets to the living God who made the planets, the heaven and the earth and sea, and everything that is in them. So we see who was the one that was worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars? The Galatians. Now, this is very important. So now we come to Acts 17, 1 and 2. Okay, Galatians. So here we are. Now, many of you were with me about less than a year ago, and we went to Turkey. We were in the Smyrna of the 7 churches. They're all in here. We went to Troas, which is ancient Troy, where they all hid inside of this big horse figure, if you remember, and then escaped and killed everybody. And so then we landed in Istanbul, and we're going around to the 7 churches. We come up here, and then look, we go to Neapolis, Philippi, which is where the Philippians book was written. We go to Thessalonica. We went there. We drove right by Berea. We came all the way down to Athens. We went over to Corinth. Okay, we were all over the place. And listen to this, Acts 17, 1 and 2. But I want you to see the map. Afterwards, they came to Thessalonica. Okay, so there's Thessalonica right there. That's where they were. And it says there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his custom was, went into them and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures. So he's in Thessalonica. And guess what? He keeps the Sabbath. And 3 times, 3 weeks in a row, he's reasoning with them in the scriptures. And then look at verse 10 and 11. And the brethren immediately, they sent Paul and Silas away by night unto Berea. How many of you know about the Bereans? And all the Gentile Christians say, oh, the Bereans were smart. They were really good. Well, let's read what happened. It says, Paul and Silas left by night to Berea, who coming there went into the synagogue of the Jews. These are more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether the things Paul was saying are true. Guess what that means? That means Paul is subject to the scriptures, and they were all Jews. The Bereans were Jews. That's what it says. They go to a synagogue. The Bereans weren't Gentiles, not one Gentile there. The Bereans are Jews, and they're listening to what Paul says, and then they're looking at the Torah to make sure what he's saying is true. So being a Berean, the Greeks didn't know Hebrew. They had no Gideon Bible. Okay? It was all the Torah, the Tanakh, and that's what they were searching. The Gentiles couldn't have. They didn't know Hebrew. Okay? All right. So, in Acts 17:15-17, then those conducting Paul brought him all the way down to Athens. You can see on the map, Athens is way down there from Berea, the gorgeous drive. And look at this. It says those conducting Paul brought him to Athens, having received a command unto Silas and Timothy, that with all speed they may come to him. They departed, and Paul is waiting for them. Where? In Athens. And the Spirit was stirred in him, beholding the city totally given over to idolatry. Therefore, here he is again, reasoning, not in the churches, there were no churches. He was in the synagogue with the Jews and Gentile worshipers. See, Jews and Gentiles got together. They were all together in the synagogue. There wasn't a church across the street. And he was in the marketplace every day with those who would meet with him. Okay, here comes Acts 17:18-20. Some of those who were supporters, but this is when he's in the marketplace every day, there were supporters of the theories of the Epicureans and the Stoics who met with him. Okay, here he is. He's having a meeting in Athens with the Epicureanists and the Stoics. Who does not know what they taught? Everyone here knows what they taught? Everyone? Wow, one hand. Okay, is there anyone who don't know what they taught? Oh, okay, I'll share with you what they taught. I'll have one of you that know. Come on up and tell. Okay, let me start here. Let me finish reading it. And it says, some said, what is this talker of foolish words saying? And others, well, he seems to be a preacher of some strange gods, because he's preaching of Jesus and is coming back from the dead. And so it says they took him to Mars Hill, saying, will you make clear to us what is this new of yours? Okay, I was there. Here's a picture of the Areopagus at night from our hotel room. And right next door to it is Mars Hill. This is where Paul stood and spoke. That's Mars Hill, which is right next to the Areopagus. I was there. I know. Yeah. I wasn't there at that time. Okay. The Epicureans and the Stoics all began the same time, about 300 BC. The Epicureanists believed that the best way to be happy, how many of us want to be happy? We all want to be happy. Well, the best way to be happy was, and not sad, is don't want anything. If you don't want anything, how can you ever be sad? You'll always be happy, they said. It's the wanting of things that leads to pain. So Epicureans had an important influence on Christianity. The Christian idea that holy people should separate themselves from the world, don't think about their bodies or about the things they own or their friends and family, and just focus on heaven, is where you get the monasteries from and the convents. That's where this came from Greek philosophy.